September 1944, Arracourt, France. A column of German Panther tanks rolled through lifting fog toward the headquarters of the 4th Armoured Division. Above them, something small and slow banked into a dive. It was made of cotton fabric. It weighed 680 pounds. The Panther beneath it weighed 45 tons. The pilot reached for a toggle switch on his wing root. A rocket streaked downward. The Panther stopped moving. This is the story of the cheapest, slowest, most fragile tank killer of the Second World War. A $2,500 training plane, powered by a 65-horsepower engine, weaker than most motorcycles, armed with 6 infantry bazookas strapped to its wings with plywood and wire. No armour, no gunsight, 12 gallons of fuel. It destroyed more German armour than most Shermans ever engaged, and nobody, not the army, not the enemy, not even the pilot, planned it that way. To understand why anyone would strap bazookas to a Piper Cub, you have to understand what it felt like to see a war you could not fight. The L4 Grasshopper existed for one purpose: directing artillery fire. 2 pilots per field artillery battalion, flying figure 8s at 1,500 feet, radioing target coordinates to gun crews on the ground. The system worked brilliantly. Liaison aircraft performed 97% of all artillery adjustment missions in the European theatre. The L4 was not a weapon. It was a pair of eyes. The problem was what happened between the radio calls. An L4 pilot would spot a column of German tanks advancing on American positions. He would radio for fire support, and then he would wait. Sometimes the guns were in range, sometimes they were not. Sometimes fighter bombers were available. More often they were busy elsewhere. And in those minutes between sighting and response, the pilot sat in his fabric cockpit at 85 miles per hour, watching enemy armour close on men he knew by name, unable to do a single thing about it. The army had never intended the L4 to fight. The entire aircraft was a civilian Piper Cub painted olive drab. Bill Piper Jr. once said all they had to do was change the colour to produce a military airplane. The airframe was cotton fabric stretched over welded steel tubing sealed with cellulose lacquer. No armour plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no bulletproof glass. The fuel gauge was a wire sticking out of the engine cowling attached to a cork float. Pilots watched it bob up and down to know how much fuel remained. Some L4 crews refueled at roadside gas stations. The weapon that would change everything was already sitting in infantry supply depots across France. The M1A1 bazooka was designed to be fired from a soldier's shoulder at ground level. Nobody in the army had written a manual for firing one from the sky. But by the summer of 1944, one pilot had stopped reading manuals. The Piper L4H Grasshopper was powered by a Continental flat-4 engine producing 65 horsepower at 2,300 revolutions per minute. Its maximum speed was 85 miles per hour. Its service ceiling was 12,000 feet. It could stay airborne for roughly 3 hours on 12 gallons of fuel, less than most car gas tanks. Its wingspan stretched 35 feet, its empty weight sat at 680 pounds, and a strong man could lift its tail off the ground and drag it by hand. The M1A1 bazooka weighed 13 pounds and fired a 3.5-pound shaped charge rocket, capable of penetrating roughly 3 inches of steel armour. At 300 yards, an infantryman could reasonably expect to hit a tank. The weapon had a critical limitation. Its shaped charge was designed to punch through armour at near-perpendicular angles. Against the thick, sloped frontal plates of a Panther or Tiger, the rocket often ricocheted or shattered without penetrating. What Major Charles Carpenter figured out was geometry. A bazooka fired from above would strike a tank where its armour was thinnest, the roof. Even a Tiger, carrying over 4 inches of frontal plate, had barely 1.5 inches on top. The attack angle that made the bazooka useless on the ground made it lethal from the air. No engineering committee designed this. A high school history teacher worked it out by looking down. The modification happened in stages. Carpenter started with 2 M1 launchers, one mounted per wing strut. After destroying a German armoured car on his first armed sortie, he added 4 more tubes and upgraded to the improved M9 model with its more reliable magneto ignition. The final configuration was 6 launchers, 3 bundled side by side on a plywood shelf bolted to each set of wing lift struts, positioned just outboard of the jury struts that braced the main supports at mid-span. Here is where the obsession shows. Carpenter angled the tubes upward at roughly 20 to 25 degrees relative to the fuselage. This was not guesswork. When the pilot pushed the nose into a 30 to 40 degree dive, that upward angle aligned the rockets precisely with his forward line of sight through the windscreen. The entire aircraft became the gunsight. He aimed the plane at the tank and toggled a switch. A firing panel with 6 individual toggles was installed on the upper left wing root inside the cockpit. Wires ran from each tube along the struts to the switches. The pilot could fire rockets one at a time or all at once. There was no other aiming system. Each tube held a single rocket, and reloading in flight was impossible. After 6 shots, Carpenter had to land, have ordnance crews reload the tubes, and take off again. To compensate for the added weight, 6 loaded bazookas, plywood and wiring added roughly 120 pounds, he flew every combat mission alone, without the observer who normally occupied the rear seat. He painted the name Rosie the Rocketer on the fuselage. His daughter Carol later confirmed it was a tribute to the women building aircraft in factories back home. What remained to be proven was whether the contraption would survive contact with real tanks, under real fire. Carpenter's position gave him rare freedom. He served as personal pilot to Major General John S. Wood, the 4th Armoured Division's commander, a former chemistry professor nicknamed Tiger Jack because he paced and argued back when Patton shouted at him. The British strategist Basil Liddell Hart later called Wood the Rommel of the American armoured forces. Flying for Wood meant Carpenter operated beyond the front lines routinely, knew the tactical picture intimately, and had latitude that ordinary liaison pilots never received. When he began his armed sorties, his chain of command approved the modification officially. The armed Grasshopper's first real test under sustained fire came during the Battle of Arracourt, one of the largest tank engagements on the Western Front. On September 19, 1944, Carpenter spotted German armour trying to outflank a platoon of American tank destroyers. He dove through rain and fog and fired. The rockets missed their targets, but the attack alerted the ground forces to the flanking manoeuvre, and the tank destroyers turned the German advance. The next day was the weapon's proving ground. Around noon, the fog lifted and Carpenter spotted a company of Panther tanks and armoured cars advancing directly on the headquarters of the 4th Armoured Division's Combat Command A. He dove through a barrage of ground fire, toggling switches, sending rockets into the thin roof armour of the lead vehicles. He fired all 6, landed in a nearby field, reloaded, took off, and dove again. 3 combat sorties that afternoon, at least 16 rockets fired. When it was over, the division credited the armed Grasshopper with 2 immobilized tanks, several destroyed armoured cars, and a dozen enemy casualties. More importantly, the remaining Panthers retreated. 4th Armoured Division records stated that a single liaison aircraft had stopped a German counterattack, a recognition that researcher Joe Scheel later described as almost unprecedented for an aircraft type that was never meant to carry weapons. Subscribe if you're finding this interesting. It helps the channel and means you will not miss the next one. Now, back to Rosie. On a separate occasion during the advance through France, Carpenter fired his bazookas into a German column, then landed in a field beside the burning wreckage. He found a discarded rifle on the ground and used it to take 6 German soldiers prisoner, making him quite possibly the only pilot in history to destroy enemy vehicles from the air and capture enemy soldiers on the ground in the same engagement. Word travelled. As Carpenter himself told a Stars and Stripes correspondent, word must be getting around among those Germans to watch out for Cubs with bazookas on them, because every time he showed up now they shot with everything they had. They never used to bother Cubs. Bazookas, he said, must be bothering them a bit. The armed Grasshopper was never going to replace a P-47. It carried 6 rockets with no ability to reload in the air. Its effective range meant diving to within 100 meters of the target directly into the reach of every machine gun and rifle the enemy could bring to bear. In a letter home dated August 12, 1944, Carpenter admitted he had been taking quite a few chances lately. He had collected a bullet hole through the wing and clipped a church steeple with one wheel. He called it very little for what might have happened. Other pilots tried copying his tactics. They found, as one newspaper reported, that driving their frail aircraft into a hail of German small arms fire was extremely unhealthy, and returned to their observation duties. The weapon system required something no supply depot could issue: the specific nerve of one pilot willing to dive cotton fabric at a panzer column, again and again, with no armour between him and the machine guns except doped lacquer and luck. But that limitation revealed what the armed Grasshopper actually did to the battlefield. Before Carpenter, German troops refused to fire on L4s because shooting revealed their positions to the very artillery the Cubs were directing. After Carpenter, they had to fire at every Cub, which revealed their positions anyway. The armed Grasshopper did not need to destroy every tank it attacked. It needed only to exist. Its mere presence changed the calculation for every German unit that heard a 65 horsepower engine droning overhead. A weapon does not have to kill to be decisive. Sometimes it just has to make the enemy afraid of something they used to ignore. Official records credited the armed Grasshopper with 6 confirmed tank kills, including 2 Tigers, plus several armoured cars. Witness accounts suggested as many as 14. Either figure qualified as a tank ace, achieved from a cockpit that cost less than a used car. The concept Carpenter proved, a cheap, slow observation platform armed with anti-armour weapons, attacking from above, echoed forward through decades of military design. The Cessna Bird Dog, developed in 1949 as the L4's direct replacement, carried 8 underwing rockets in Vietnam. The OV-10 Bronco was purpose-built for the exact mission Carpenter had improvised: armed reconnaissance from short, unprepared airstrips. When the Army tried to permanently arm its own fixed-wing observation aircraft in the 1960s, the Air Force blocked the effort, a bureaucratic outcome that would have baffled the man who had demonstrated the idea with plywood and wire 2 decades earlier. The concept eventually migrated to helicopters, and then, most strikingly, to unmanned drones. The parallels between Rosie the Rocketer and modern armed platforms are difficult to miss: small, slow, cheap, expendable, armed with anti-armour weapons, devastating from above. The line runs straight from a fabric Piper Cub over France to the skies over modern battlefields. Carpenter himself never saw any of it. Diagnosed with cancer in early 1945, doctors gave him 2 years. He went back to teaching history at Urbana High School in Illinois and ran a boys' camp in the Ozarks during summers. He wrote poetry about the war, one poem ending with a captured German soldier being led away by guards who smiled and wrongly guessed the poet was free. He died on March 22, 1966, 21 years after his 2-year prognosis. Rosie the Rocketer disappeared. Dumped in a German surplus yard in 1946, the aircraft was sold to a Swiss civilian, repainted yellow, and spent years towing gliders for an Austrian flying club. It became the 2nd civilian aircraft ever registered in the country. Eventually it was disassembled and stored in a museum at Graz, completely unidentified. Online, decades later, skeptics dismissed the entire story as wartime propaganda. Then one night, Carpenter's daughter Carol could not sleep. She searched her father's nickname on the internet and found the skeptics. She went to the basement, pulled out boxes of letters, photographs, and documents her mother Elda had kept for decades, and set the record straight. Her article caught the eye of airline pilot and aircraft researcher Joe Scheel, who traced the plane's serial number through Swiss and Austrian registration records and found it sitting in a museum in Graz. When the plane was positively identified, Scheel made an observation worth repeating. This Cub, with its unknown number of tanks and armoured cars destroyed, was the most destructive aircraft surviving from the ground war across Europe. More confirmed enemy vehicles than any extant fighter or bomber. Restorer Colin Powers stripped the old fabric and found the proof underneath. Bullet holes, a double patch where a round had punched clean through a front strut and out the other side. Carpenter's granddaughter repainted the nose art. On July 4, 2020, Rosie the Rocketer flew again. Today it hangs in the American Heritage Museum in Massachusetts, frozen in a dive behind a German Panther tank. 680 pounds of fabric and steel aimed at 45 tons of armour. A toggle switch on the wing root, 6 rockets, no gunsight, 12 gallons of fuel, and a 65 horsepower engine that changed the way wars are fought from above. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not the one the enemy fears most. It is the one they never thought to fear at all. If you could go back to 1944 and standardize Carpenter's modification across every L4 squadron in Europe, would it have changed the ground war? Or would it have gotten more pilots killed